Hiya guys, today we're going to talk all about shocks, and I know I said about 2 months ago that we were doing two parts to a video about shocks, where the last part we talked about building the shocks, and this part I was going to talk about the shock setup and that side of it, how to actually choose the right pistons, oil, things like that. Well, finally, here's the second part of that video. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about shock oil. So the first big reason that you would change the shock oil is you're actually trying to keep the low speed damping the same. So quick backtrack, obviously changing the shock oil pretty much is done to change the low speed damping, which is kind of how the car feels on the table. That's the way I would describe the low speed damping. Just as you're feeling the car like this, that's the shocks moving at a slow speed comparatively to when they land a jump or quickly hit a bump, which would be high speed damping. So that's the reason that we change the shock oil, is to change the low speed damping. Now, what can affect what shock oil is needed? Well, if you're going to run, say, a different piston, you want to change to a bigger hole size, then obviously you're going to have to also increase the oil to keep the low speed damping the same. Also, there's things like temperature. If you start off the day and it's cold and it's raining, and then by the end of the day the sun's out, you're going to have to change the shock oil by maybe 2.5 or 5 weight to keep the shocks working at the same point. So that's another one of the reasons that you would have to change the shock oil. Now obviously it's also used to change the low speed damping on the track. We don't always want to keep it the same. Sometimes we want to change it. So what changes when we actually change the low speed damping on the track? Well, in the sense of how the car rolls, obviously when you're going around the track, your car's always moving a little bit. It's moving from left to right, pitching forwards and backwards. And the more damping that you have, the slower that is going to occur. So when you accelerate and your car squats back, that will happen more slowly when you have thicker shock oil. So you'll probably notice in high speed, sort of quick sections of the track, your car's going to be a little bit more stable, won't be lurching around so much, and it's going to probably be slightly more controllable in those sections of track. Also, if you kind of have a quick point of the track where your car's collapsing, but you're only on throttle for a short amount of time or something, you can use shock oil to stop that from happening, because the car will eventually roll to the same point, but if it only is like a quick part of the track where it collapses, sometimes increasing the shock oil can help with that in that section. So that's kind of why you would change the shock oil there. A thing about the shock oil as well is that it's kind of something that you just get a feel for. You might sort of need to copy someone's setup at some point, or feel a few cars in the pits, things like that, to get the shocks where they feel like they need to be, because it can be hard to sort of find a starting point for shocks, and I think that is a good thing. It's kind of something where the same sort of feel in shock is usually like what's going to work. The same feel of low speed damping is about what will always run. So you kind of just need to get a feel for it, about what feels right, and then you'll be good to go. Another thing with the shock oil is that some people like to change the two ends individually at the same time. So they'll change the front without changing the rear, something like that, because they want to gain more steering. But I'm not a major fan of doing that. I always like to keep the car sort of feeling similar, both ends on the table. So like, say you drop it, it will kind of rise back up at the same rate. I like to try and keep it feeling like that, because that way I do think the car does sort of handle better and perform better on the track when the front and rear are working together at the same rate. So say I wanted to gain more steering or something like that, then usually I would change the spring or something else geometry wise on the front end. I'd never lower the front shock oil to try and gain steering. I don't think that's the right way of doing it, because I think you do want to keep that nice balance between the front and rear with the shocks, so your car kind of just works together around the track. The next thing to talk about is the piston hole size. So for the minute, imagine we're going to be running the same amount of holes all the time, but just changing the hole size in the pistons. Now, why would we do this? Well, we've just talked about the shock oil, which is sort of how we affect the low speed damping, how the car feels on the table. But what if we want to affect the high speed damping? And this is where the hole size of the piston does come into play. So if you want to reduce the high speed damping, then you can increase the hole size. If you want to increase the high speed damping, then you need to reduce the hole size. It's often called pack in RC. So people will talk about how much their car is packing around the track. And more pack effectively refers to more high speed damping. The shock's locking up more when there's a higher velocity on the piston. That's pretty much what high speed damping and pack refers to. Now, an important thing to note here is that obviously when you want to change the high speed damping, usually you don't want to affect the low speed damping. So like I was talking about, if you say go from a 1.7 piston hole sizes to a 1.8, you're going to need to increase the shock coil by, usually I find it's about 5 weight. I usually find if I adjust 0.1 in a piston, if I then readjust by 5 weight, the low speed damping feels the same. So obviously if you're running 30 weight with a 1.7, if you then run 35 weight with a 1.8, that's changing both holes or however many holes you have. Usually I find that gives you a similar feeling on the table, but then obviously your high speed is going to change. So why do you want to change the high speed damping for the track? Well, obviously the track, again, as I've said before, setup is all a compromise. The track's part of jumps, bumps, you've got all sorts going on. So over the bumps, like small bumps, you really don't want much pack at all. You don't want much high speed damping because you want your shocks to really work and take those bumps. However, when you have like a steep angle change in the track or you have a jump, you do need high speed damping so that your car can land, it doesn't bottom out, and you don't feel your chassis like bouncing off the bumps all the time, because that's actually worse than your wheels bouncing off the bumps a lot of the time. So it's a compromise. If you increase the hole size in the piston, your car is going to be usually much better over small bumps at high speed especially. So say the sweeper at the end of the straight is quite bumpy and you increase the hole size, your car is going to be much plush around there and feel a lot more sucked to the track around that corner. So pretty much high speed bumps you're going to have a big benefit, and also slow speed bumps a bit of a benefit as well. But the disadvantage is that obviously you're not going to land as well, so you might have more double bouncing. And also if you have like quite big bumps that are almost sort of bigger than the car in a way, you can find that the car starts to bottom out in the bumps and the chassis actually hits the floor. And when that happens, that's much worse. That's an even worse thing. So there's been times where I've increased the hole size and it's made it sort of worse over the bumps in a bad way. And you can tell that it's actually now the chassis is catching the bump. So rather than having that support from the pistons, the car's kind of moving down too far and it's just catching the floor. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. But generally, you're going to find better handling over bumps with bigger holes, but worse off jumps, and the opposite for smaller holes and things like that. And like I said, remember, when you change the holes, remember to change the oil as well to keep the car feeling consistent at low speed, and just change the high speed damping. Now we also have the amount of holes in the piston. Now, to me, this is not changed to change the amount of pack, because I could create a 3-hole piston with more pack than a 2-hole piston, or I could create a 3-hole piston with less pack than a 2-hole piston, depending on how big the holes are, like I just said. You can adjust the hole size of the pistons to create as much or little pack as you want. So I would never change the amount of holes to change the pack. That doesn't really make sense to me. But what it does normally change is sort of how the car feels and drives on the track. I think it's sort of between the low speed and high speed damping, we obviously have a curve in our shocks of how the damping force increases. And I think when you change the amount of holes, that is effectively what changes. And obviously all sorts of flow characteristics inside the shocks change that I don't really understand. So to me, on the track, it usually just feels like a slightly different feel to the car when you change from, say, a 2-hole to 3-hole pistons and you sort of keep the amount of pack the same. The car usually, I find with, say, like a 3-hole piston compared to 2-hole, the car normally drives slightly sort of flatter perhaps. And it just drives differently with a different amount of holes. So usually we pretty much always run 2-hole, and we try to stick with the same amount of holes and then just tune the pack with obviously the hole size of the holes. So it's kind of a thing where once you settle on an amount of holes, you're probably going to stick with it. And then you're going to tune the hole size to change the pack. That's the way that we kind of do it anyway. So that's that part. We also have the piston thickness that we can mess with. Now, from Associated, we have the 2mm thick pistons, and we also have the 2.5mm thick pistons. So there's different things to mess with there. Now, we usually find that the thin pistons are a little bit more sort of pointy and reactive, and the fatter pistons kind of calm the car down, and it's just sort of easier to drive with the fat pistons in. The thin pistons sort of almost make the car feel excited to drive in like a weird way. But we have also found that if we run, say, a hole which is too big in a thin piston, so say we run like a 2mm hole in a 2mm piston, the car can start to become weird, and it can start to become worse over bumps again, even though the holes are getting bigger, which is kind of not what you'd expect. So we have found that sort of once you get over, say, like a 1.8 or 1.9 hole, you want to go from the 2mm pistons to the 2.5mm pistons. And I've spoke to people who understand fluid dynamics and stuff much more than me, and they say that that does make sense. That's kind of a thing that would happen. If you get a hole which is sort of too square or over square, then the fluid dynamics in the shocks becomes a bit unpredictable, and strange things can happen. So that is a thing. What we do sort of do now, if we get over, say, 1.8 or 1.9, we switch to the thicker pistons to keep the length of the hole at that certain ratio over the size of the hole itself. And it does keep the shocks more consistent when we do that as well. We also have the shock positions that we can adjust. So thinking about just the angle of the shock itself, what is changing there is the sort of rate of progression of the shock. Now, the shocks don't actually work linearly with the wheel, because we have our suspension arms which are not always at the same angle to the shock. So as the wheel compresses, obviously the shock is moving more and more compared to how much the wheel is moving. So the shocks and the springs are all kind of working progressively there. And if we create a bigger angle between the arm and the shock by lying them down, that effect is increased. So that's effectively what we're changing when we change the shock positions, is the angle. But also when you change shock positions, you can't change purely the angle of the shock. You're also going to be changing kind of the motion ratio between the wheel and the movement of the piston as well. Because when you, say, move the shocks in on the arm, the piston isn't going to move as far as the wheel compared to if the shock was further out. So you need to watch for that as well. If you, say, move the shock a long way in, you might need to go down in piston hole size, things like that, because the piston won't be moving as quickly, and it's obviously going to feel different on the track. So you may need to readjust for things like that. But generally, I find, so let's talk about the front shocks. Normally I find if you lean the front shocks over, you sort of lose a little bit of initial steering. It's slightly smoother into the corners, but you kind of gain like mid-corner and exit steering usually. The car just sort of normally feels a bit smoother on the front end and then sort of hugs in sort of mid-corner. Whereas when you stand them up, it sort of makes the car more pointy and direct, and it sort of changes direction a lot faster as well. That's what I find with it. And then with the rear shocks, when they're more stood up, you generally sort of lose a little bit of side bite into the corners, but you do seem to gain sort of rear end support out of the corners. So that's that. And then obviously if you lie them down, you get the opposite, where you can gain side bite into the corners, but then out of the corners, you might lose that little bit of support there. So that's kind of the shock positions as well. Again, that's the type of thing where usually, especially with the arm position, usually once you've found the position that you like on the arm, it's not going to be something you want to change drastically, because it changes the oil you'll want, the piston you'll probably want, the spring you'll want. It changes a lot. You can change, like, I think changing the holes on the tower is sort of less of an effect as changing on the arm. So you can sort of lean in one on the tower. If your car just feels edgy and all too nervous, if you just lean the front and rear in one on the tower, that can calm it down. But at the same time, if it feels a bit dead and maybe you're just like slightly off the pace you want to be, you could stand them up, and that might liven your car up, make it a little bit more aggressive to drive. So that's that for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was helpful. And yeah, comment below what you sort of think about your shocks, and we'll see you in the next one.